She said she couldn't carry life. She said her body was engineered for war, not warmth. But that night, something inside her changed. The door sealed behind them with a soft hiss. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in her eyes wasn't fear. It was confusion, longing, a silent question she was too proud to ask out loud. Her skin shimmered under the cold blue light. Not human, not alien, something in between, something unfinished. And for the first time since she crash-landed into his world, she didn't want to be alone anymore. She was designed to end lives until one quiet man in a bookstore unknowingly gave her a reason to create one. The rain hadn't started yet, but the sky over Oregon was already heavy with the kind of clouds that make you think of endings. Inside Thorn and Thread, time seemed to fold in on itself, tucked between crooked shelves and books that smelled like forgotten summers. Micah Thorne moved like someone used to silence. Since his sister passed, he hadn't needed much else. He let the shop breathe for him, the creak of the floorboards, the soft tick of the ceiling fan, the rustle of someone flipping through poetry they'd never finish. That was enough. Most days, but not today. Today, the bell above the door chimed not loud, but sharp enough to break the stillness. Micah barely looked up. Locals wandered in all the time, chasing warmth, nostalgia, or just the strange carved stone that sat in his front window like it had always belonged to another world. But this was different. The air changed. Not dramatically, not like lightning. It was more like a pressure drop, subtle, instinctive, something that brushed against the back of your neck and made your pulse shift without knowing why. When he finally glanced toward the door, his breath caught in his throat. She stood framed by the light outside, tall and unmoving. Her skin held the faintest glow, like moonlight on snow that never melts. Hair like silvered obsidian flowed behind her shoulders, and her eyes, violet, endless, searching, settled on his with a kind of stillness that made everything else in the room feel suddenly outdated. She wasn't beautiful in the way humans understand it. She was something older than beauty, something quiet and dangerous and grieving. Micah straightened, more out of instinct than manners. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice lower than he expected. She blinked once, then spoke softly, but with the weight of someone who'd crossed light years just to ask a question. "I'm looking for something forgotten." He hesitated. "A book? Or maybe a memory?" She said it without looking away. And something about the way she stood there like she was holding herself together by choice made Micah feel like the dust in his shop wasn't from time, but from the world she just stepped out of. "We've got both," he said quieter this time. "Back shelf, left side. Some of those books tend to find you before you find them." She didn't thank him, didn't smile, just walked past graceful, silent, humming faintly like a machine built from starlight and sorrow. Micah turned to watch, not because he was curious, but because something inside him knew. This wasn't a customer. This was a beginning. She moved through the back aisle like a memory walking its way home, fingers trailing along the worn spines of books, as if listening through the leather, paper, and dust. She didn't rush. Every motion was precise, measured, not hesitant, but deliberate, like she was letting the shelves speak first. Micah stayed behind the counter, pretending to organize receipts he hadn't looked at in weeks, but his eyes kept drifting. He wasn't watching her the way a man watches a woman. He watched like a man afraid to blink in case she disappeared. She stopped. One hand hovered over a thin, leather-bound volume. It looked unremarkable, cracked spine, no title. The edges curled like it had survived. Rain, heat, time. She pulled it from the shelf and turned, holding it with both hands like it might vanish if handled too roughly. "This," she said quietly, "is it real?" Micah squinted at the book, stepping closer. No title, no author. Just a swirl of unfamiliar symbols etched faintly into the cover like ghost handwriting. It wasn't something he remembered logging into inventory. That one came from a box someone left on the steps. Estate clean-out, I think. I never cataloged it. He reached for it gently. "May I?" She nodded, her eyes never leaving the cover. Micah opened it and stopped. The pages were yellowed but intact. Ink danced across the paper in delicate, looping characters that weren't Latin. Not Cyrillic, not any Earth-based script he could recognize. It looked more like someone had painted a language rather than written it. I've never seen anything like this, he murmured. I have, she replied. He looked up. You can read it? A pause. Then, softly, not entirely, but I remember it. The way one remembers a song they were never taught. Wait, he said, voice tightening. Are you saying this is alien? She hesitated, and for the first time, he saw something crack in her, not weakness, but weariness. The kind that comes from carrying something too long in silence. That's the word your kind uses, she said finally. I prefer Kagan. It is my name and my burden. Micah absorbed that slowly. The bookstore around them suddenly felt much smaller. How long have you been here? She closed the journal and held it to her chest. Since the fall. Since our ships scattered and our names were erased. Most of us are gone now. Dusted into myths. I am one of the last. There was no drama in her voice. Just the kind of sorrow that had settled in so deeply, it no longer needed to shout. Micah took a step back, not out of fear but reverence. He looked at the journal again, then at her. You can have it, he said, no charge. She looked up, startled. Why? He shrugged, unsure how to explain the ache in his chest. Because you look like someone who's lost enough already. For the first time, her expression softened. Just slightly, her lips curved, not quite a smile, but something reaching for one. Thank you, Micah Thorne. And just like that, the room didn't feel so quiet anymore. Kagan had returned 3 times since that first day. Always near closing, always without warning. And Micah, though he said nothing, found himself adjusting the lights, straightening the shelves, sweeping the floor he'd long given up on caring about just in case she came. Tonight, she did. She stepped inside as the sky began to fall in silver ribbons, the bell above the door chiming with its familiar soft ache. Micah didn't ask where she'd been. Some people carry stories that can't be told in a single visit. She walked to the counter with a quiet sense of purpose and placed 3 books down, parenting guides. He blinked at the titles. The Gentle Way to Raise a Child, Emotional Intelligence for Early Development, When Little Hands Hold Big Questions. He raised an eyebrow, curious but careful. Expanding your collection? He asked with a half smile. Kagan didn't return it. Instead, her eyes deep, steady, unreadable held his as she answered. Number, I'm trying to understand something I was never given. Micah nodded slowly, folding his arms. The air between them shifted again, warmer this time, but still wrapped in something fragile. Were you orphaned? She looked past him, into the shelves behind. Not searching, remembering. I was assembled. The word hung there, awkward and cold. She continued, voice low, like she wasn't sure it deserved to be spoken aloud. My generation was grown in biocradles, designed for durability, reflex, precision, not love. We weren't born into families. We were assigned handlers, protocols, targets. I was taught to break bones before I ever learned how to hold a hand. Micah said nothing. He just listened. We were told it was mercy, that warriors had no need for tenderness, that motherhood was inefficient. She let out a breath short, bitter. But somewhere deep inside, I knew that was a lie. I didn't want war. I wanted warmth. A name whispered by a child. A place at the edge of someone's dream. Micah stepped from behind the counter, slow and deliberate. He didn't touch her, just stood close enough for silence to feel like a choice, not a void. What changed? He asked gently. She looked down, her hands curling around the spine of one of the books. Her voice wavered not from fear, but from the weight of the words. They destroyed it. My genetic core, the furnace where life could have been. It was sterilized during a mission. Strategically, it made sense. Biologically, it made me disposable. She didn't cry. Not yet. But something in her shimmered. A hairline fracture in a statue, long thought unbreakable. I can't have children, Micah. Not like your kind does. And yet I wake up every cycle with an ache in my chest for something I will never hold. Now she looked at him. What does that make me? Micah, voice thick, answered the only way he knew how. It makes you human enough to hurt, and alive enough to want more. She stared at him for a long time. The rain outside had grown heavier now, but in here, it was still. Slowly, as if deciding whether the world could be trusted again, Kagan whispered, I don't want to be a weapon anymore. Micah took a quiet breath. Then stop aiming at your own heart. And finally, she allowed herself to exhale. The forest didn't call to him, it simply accepted him. Micah walked without a destination, through damp soil and silence. The kind of quiet that settles not in your ears, but behind your ribs. Morning mist clung low, and the trees stood still, like old sentinels watching, but never speaking. He didn't come out here often, not anymore. But something had been pressing at the edges of his thoughts, restless, unnamed. So he let his boots take him where they wanted. And then he saw it. Half buried beneath a fallen branch and a layer of moss was a shape that didn't belong. Angular, metallic, burned in places but intact. It didn't glint, it pulsed. A faint light, steady and rhythmic, like the breath of something sleeping. Micah knelt. The object was the size of a coffin, though narrower. Sleek in design, but battered like it had clawed its way through atmosphere and memory. There were no markings, no language. Just a seam down the center and the faintest hiss when he touched it. It opened. What lay inside was not a weapon, not a machine. It was a child. She was curled into herself, small as a curled-up dream, skin pale violet with thin veins of soft light running beneath. Her hair clung to her face in frozen strands. There was no movement, no sound. But she was alive. Somehow, he knew. Micah didn't move for a long moment. He couldn't, is 80. There was something sacred about the stillness, the sense that he was standing at the edge of someone else's miracle. He reached for his phone. There was only one person he could call. Kagan arrived without a word. No knock, no hesitation. She crossed the threshold like someone returning to a place she'd seen once, long ago, in a dream. The moment she saw the pod, something shifted in her. Her breath caught. Her steps slowed. She dropped to her knees beside the open shell. For a moment, she didn't speak. Didn't even blink. Then, with reverence, a nymph. Micah crouched beside her, unsure of the word. What does that mean? A seedling, from one of the old colonies. She was meant to wake into a new world, not this one. Her fingers hovered just above the child's face, never touching, as if afraid the slightest contact would break whatever fragile thread still connected the girl to life. She's in cryostasis, Kagan murmured. Deep sleep, preserved, but barely. She paused. Something flickered behind her eyes, grief, yes, but layered with awe. And something else. Hope. Micah leaned in. Can you wake her? She didn't answer right away. Her gaze never left the child. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, quiet, certain. Not alone. She turned to him, and for the first time since she walked into his life, her walls were gone. Her voice carried no armor. But together we might. The pod now lay across the spare bed, surrounded by wires and soft towels. Kagan worked in silence, hands moving with strange precision, half scientist, half priestess. Micah didn't know what half the tools were, but he brought her what she asked for. Warm water, clean linens, light. The air smelled faintly of ozone and something older, something electric. The girl didn't move, but her presence was unmistakable. Even asleep, she radiated something, a presence that pulled the room into its own orbit. Each night, Kagan sat beside her and whispered songs in a language Micah didn't understand but could feel. Songs with no sharp edges, only stars and longing. And lullabies meant for children who had never yet taken a breath. Micah stood in the doorway once, watching her read to the girl from an old storybook. Her voice cracked on the word mother. She can't hear you, he said gently. Kagan didn't look up. She can feel me. Children are never just flesh. They remember things the universe doesn't. Her hand rested lightly on the pod, not claiming, not demanding, just waiting. And what if she never wakes? Micah asked. Kagan closed her eyes. Then at least she will have been loved. There was nothing more to say. But in the stillness that followed, something began to change. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. The house held its breath that night. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the windows, and the trees whispered things no one was meant to hear. Inside, everything was still. Even time felt like it had paused, unsure whether to go forward or backward. Micah sat at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea he'd forgotten to drink. He wasn't waiting for anything, but he wasn't moving either. Some part of him had learned to recognize these moments, the quiet before something breaks or blooms. Down the hall, in the guest room, Kagan sat beside the pod. She hadn't left its side in days, not even to sleep. Every evening, she would hum softly under her breath, melodies in a language older than the walls around her. She spoke to the girl inside the way one might speak to a star that had fallen gently, carefully, as though the wrong word might send it fading back into the sky. Then came the sound. Not loud, not sharp, just a pulse. Like the heart of the room had decided to beat again. Micah froze. The pod glowed soft pink at first, then brighter, the light stretching outward in delicate waves. It was the kind of light that didn't just illuminate, it remembered. And then, the hiss. That familiar seal breaking. He was already on his feet before the mist had finished curling out across the floor. Kagan was already there, hands steady, eyes wide but unafraid. They said nothing. Inside the pod, the girl stirred. At first, it was barely a breath, a twitch of fingers, then the smallest movement of her chest. And finally eyes. Ocean blue, clear, unclouded, awake. She didn't cry. She looked. Straight at Kagan. No fear, no confusion, just recognition. As if some ancient part of her had always known who would be waiting when she woke. Kagan knelt lower, hands trembling as she reached out slowly, reverently, and the girl, without hesitation, reached back. Their hands met in the quiet, and the glow between them deepened, pulsing once like a heartbeat finding its match. Kagan's voice cracked. She's chosen me. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a hope. It was truth. There was no grand ceremony, no divine thunder from above. Just that quiet, irreversible shift. A thread tied between two beings who shared no blood but everything else that mattered. Micah stood at the edge of the room and said nothing. Because what could he say? What he saw wasn't science, or fate, or even miracle. It was something older. It was a bond. And it was complete. The next morning, light poured into the house through open windows. The pod had been moved. The guest bed made, on the living room floor, wrapped in soft blankets, the child slept. Her name, Kagan had whispered, would be Ari. Micah worked in the shed that day. Wood shavings curled at his feet, soft and clean. The cradle he built was simple pine, smoothed edges, no nails, just care and time, and hands that had finally remembered what it meant to build something worth keeping. Inside, Kagan sat on the rug, Ari in her lap. She wasn't reading, wasn't humming, just rocking gently, eyes half closed, fingertips brushing the child's glowing hair like the petals of something too delicate to name. That night, under a sky so clear it almost felt intentional, they sat together on the porch. Ari lay between them, curled into her own warmth. Her breathing steady, her presence small but infinite. Micah glanced over. You're a mother now. Kagan didn't answer at first. She just stared out across the stars. Then she looked down at Ari. She's not mine by blood, not by birth, but she belongs to me. And you to her. She turned to him, eyes filled with something softer than light. Does that frighten you? No, he said. What frightens me is how long you lived without this. She looked away, exhaled slowly, like she was letting go of something that had no name. Then, just above a whisper, thank you for giving me back a part of myself I didn't know I could still become. Micah didn't respond, he just watched her. The stars, the quiet shape of what they'd all become. And in that silence, something settled. Not finished, but whole. The first warning wasn't sound, it was weight. A sudden heaviness in the air. The kind that makes you pause without knowing why. As if the world, just for a breath, was holding something behind its back. Micah noticed it in the hallway. The lights didn't flicker, but they hesitated. And the old radio on the shelf near the coat rack, long forgotten, let out a static cough that crackled like a secret waking up. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing, breath caught between confusion and knowing. Then he heard it. A frequency. Thin, sharp. Not music, not weather, just coded breath. The kind of transmission that didn't care if anyone heard it because it already knew who it was calling. Kagan, he whispered. But she was already in the room. She stood in front of the hallway mirror, barefoot, still in her nightclothes. Her reflection didn't move. Only her eyes shifted down, toward the floorboards, toward the soil beneath. And then she spoke, not to him, but to something older than fear. I buried it. I thought it would never activate again. Micah moved beside her. What is it? She didn't answer right away, just closed her eyes, one hand pressed against the wall. Then softly, the beacon. I destroyed the core, scattered the remains, but part of it must have survived. Something old, something listening. Micah felt the cold rise up his spine like frost. Who's hearing it? She turned, and for the first time in weeks, he saw the soldier behind the mother. Not armored, not angry, just resigned. Not the kind who want peace. Her voice didn't tremble, but her fingers did. They found her, she said. He didn't ask who they were. He already knew. Somewhere deep inside, he'd always known this moment would come. That love borrowed from stars might one day have to be defended by fire. He followed her outside. The night was clear but wrong. The trees stood still as statues, and the wind had forgotten how to move. Kagan knelt in the garden, hands buried in dirt she'd once planted with hope. She pulled free a small metal shard doll, weathered, faintly glowing. Micah stared. That's it? Number, that's them. She turned it over in her palm, eyes unfocused. They never cared about me. I was a tool, discarded when peace seemed cheaper than war. But this child, this girl, they'll see her as more. Micah's chest tightened. Because of her power? Number, because she exists. And for the first time, he understood what that meant. Ari wasn't just a child. She was proof that something survived. That life found a way, even through extinction. And for those who had tried to end, either very existence was rebellion. Kagan stood slowly, the shard clenched in her fist. Her silhouette against the moonlight looked carved from something ancient and unyielding. They'll come, not to talk, not to ask. Micah stepped closer. Then we don't open the door. She turned toward him, and though her expression was steel, her voice cracked. If they take her, Micah, she won't be raised. She'll be used. They won't. His hand found hers. Steady, grounding, real. We protect her. That's what parents do, right? Her eyes met his. And just like that, the soldier faded again, leaving only the woman who had once thought she could never be a mother. But now she was. And the stars were watching. The forest didn't scream. It held its silence like a breath underwater longer than it should, longer than it was safe. And somewhere in the middle of that breath, the world changed. Micah stood at the edge of the porch, eyes fixed on the tree line. The wind had started again, but it didn't rustle. It cut. Kagan stood beside him, barefoot in the cold grass, the metal shard from the beacon clenched in her hand, still glowing faintly, like the last ember of a fire you thought had died. Overhead, the stars blinked slower. The moon watched, and then it came. A sound. Not loud, but low. Too low to hear you felt it first. Deep in the bones, a pressure against the ribs like gravity had just remembered you were small. Then came the light. A thin, silver line tore across the sky. Not a comet, not a ship. Something older than either, dressed in armor of heat and silence. It cut downward like it had always known this was the place it would fall. Kagan's voice broke the air first. They're here. Micah didn't speak. He didn't need to. His hand was already in hers. The ground shook, just slightly. Enough to remind them that the earth, too, could listen, that even soil could fear. A ship landed in the clearing beyond their home's leak, angular and far too quiet, as if it had been taught to land without being invited. The doors hissed open, and shadows stepped out. They weren't monsters, not in the way a child imagines them. They were elegant, efficient, engineered for precision, not mercy. Figures in matte black, eyes glowing like fireflies, moving with the calm of creatures who have never known resistance. One stepped forward, taller than the rest, a crown not worn but built into his form, and when he spoke, the sound was like grinding stone beneath snow. You've hidden her well. Kagan didn't move. She's not yours, she said quietly. The leader tilted his head, as if examining a crack in his own reflection. She was never meant for you. She chose me. You're obsolete. I'm hers. The words came sharper than she meant, but truer than she feared. Micah could feel her shaking, not her hands, her heart. The tremor that comes not from weakness, but from standing between two fires and deciding to stay. The leader stepped closer. She is property. She is a child. His tone didn't change. She is dangerous. Kagan's eyes narrowed. She's alive. The air trembled. And then, from the porch behind them, came a voice neither of them expected. I'm not afraid. Ari stood barefoot in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, her hair lit by the starlight. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She just looked. And the world looked back. Because in that moment, she wasn't just a child. She was living proof of something impossible, of something the galaxy had tried to erase. And yet, here she was, breathing, watching, choosing. The leader froze, not because he was outmatched, but because for the first time in his life, he didn't understand what he was facing. Micah stepped forward, standing in front of the girl without hesitation. You came here for a weapon, he said, but all she's ever wanted was to be held. Kagan moved beside him, her voice low and full of thunder. You can tell your masters this. She is not yours to claim, not anymore. She has a home now. She has a family. And if you try to take her, her eyes began to glow not bright, but deep, as if something ancient had woken up inside her, something she had locked away long ago. You will have to go through me. The leader took one more step forward and stopped. The lights in his eyes flickered, not from damage, but from doubt. You would defend her with your life? He asked. Kagan didn't blink. No, she said. And then quietly, without apology, I would defend her with everything. No one spoke. Not Kagan, not Micah, not the leader of the black-armored strangers who now surrounded their clearing like wolves in formation. And yet everything was saying something. The trees groaned in the wind as if they remembered what war tasted like. The ground buzzed not from machines, but from the tension of futures crashing into each other. And in the middle of it all, Ari, small and still, stood in the threshold of the home that had made her real. The air shifted. Kagan stepped forward. She wasn't glowing not yet, but the outline of her body began to bend the light around her, just slightly, like gravity was starting to remember her name. The leader's tone sharpened. You were decommissioned. She didn't flinch. I was reborn. You think emotion makes you strong? No, she said, quieter now, more dangerous. It makes me whole. She lifted her hand not in aggression, but in declaration. And that's when it happened. The glow wasn't sudden. It began from the center of her chest, where her heart beat loudest, where her memories lived. The light spread outwards low, molten, steady like metal, remembering how to move. It wasn't just light, it was history etched into the energy that rose off her skin. Runes and echoes, languages long buried under the ashes of broken worlds. A halo of remembrance wrapped around her like armor that had waited too long to be worn again. Micah took a step back, not from fear, but from awe. He had seen her afraid, seen her grieve, seen her become a mother. But this was who she had always been. And now she had something to protect. The leader of the intruders raised his arm in unspoken signal, and two of the shadows stepped forward. Weapons emerged from beneath their cloaks. Not guns, not blades, but tools meant for containment, for capture, for stripping identity. Micah's voice broke through. No. He moved to block them, but Kagan stopped him with a glance. Not cold, not commanding, just full of love. I've got her. The shadows advanced. But before they could cross the line between the trees and the porch, Kagan moved. She didn't leap, didn't charge. She shifted. One breath, she was still. The next, she became motion. The air bent, sound cracked, and in a heartbeat, she was in front of them, arms outstretched, palms open, and from her skin poured force. Not fire, not lightning. Memory. A wave of energy blasted from her body, quiet at first, then overwhelming. It struck the intruders like a flood of forgotten things. Grief, hope, sorrow, love. It wasn't pain that brought them to their knees. It was knowing. Knowing what she had lost, what she had chosen, and what she would never surrender again. The soldiers staggered, their weapons dimmed. The leader took a step back, his stance no longer sure. "You've evolved," he whispered. "No," Kagan replied. "I've remembered." Behind her, Ari stepped into the grass barefoot, walking toward her mother. Not fast, just sure. The glow around Kagan pulsed once, then settled, forming a dome of soft white around the two of them. Micah stepped into its edge, and instead of being pushed back, he was welcomed. Because this wasn't a shield. It was home. Ari slipped her hand into Kagan's, and just like that, the energy calmed. The light dimmed, but the threat did not. The leader straightened slowly. "This isn't over." Kagan met his gaze, eyes still burning softly. "No," she said, "but your part in it is." He hesitated longer than a creature like him should have. Then, without another word, he turned. And the shadows vanished behind him like smoke, remembering how to disappear. The ship lifted from the clearing without sound, without fire, just absence. And silence returned. The night didn't go back to normal. It never does, after something like that. But it became quiet again, real quiet. The kind that settles into the corners of rooms and under floorboards, too heavy to lift, but not heavy enough to break you. Kagan stood alone in the clearing for a while, long after the ship was gone. The grass around her was scorched in a perfect circle. Her skin still glowed faintly, like embers that refused to fade. Micah didn't call to her. He just watched from the porch, holding Ari close, one hand shielding her face, the other clutched around her tiny, glowing fingers. The girl wasn't crying. She didn't even seem afraid. Only tired. Like something ancient had passed through her, and now her body was just catching up. When Kagan finally returned, her steps were slow but steady. She sat beside them without a word, her body folding into the wood like she was trying to become part of the house. Micah reached over and placed Ari into her arms. Kagan didn't look at him. She just held the child, forehead resting gently against hers, and whispered something too soft to catch something only stars and daughters could hear. They stayed like that for a long time. No speeches. No tears. Just breathing. And when the moon slipped behind the clouds, the three of them moved inside. Together. And so, the following days came like snowfall, soft, slow, and impossible to measure while you were standing in it. Kagan no longer hummed by the pod. It was empty now. Instead, she hummed in the kitchen while heating soup, in the hallway while brushing Ari's hair, on the porch while Micah worked on repairing the fencing she'd blown apart. Ari drew on scraps of paper constellations, mostly. Some Micah recognized, others didn't exist, not here anyway. She spoke slowly and not often, but her words were always precise, as if language was something she had chosen carefully, not something she had inherited. And when she looked at Kagan, it was never with question. It was always with recognition. Micah noticed something else too. The world hadn't reacted. No news reports, no strange military cars, no unmarked men in dark suits. It was as if the encounter had folded itself back into the dark, erasing footprints as it retreated. But something in the air felt different. Charged. Awake. One afternoon, Micah found Kagan standing alone in the backyard, staring up at the sky. Ari was asleep inside. The air was crisp. Autumn had begun to bite gently at the trees. He walked up beside her. "They'll come back," she said. Not as fear, just as fact. Micah nodded. Maybe not for a long time, maybe never. But yes, they'll want to use her. Or fear her. They'll try to define her by what she can do. Micah looked over. And will remind her who she is. She turned to him then, finally, fully. There was no armor in her face now, no steel in her spine. Only softness. Gratitude. A kind of fragile, glowing strength that could only come from someone who had been bent but never broken. "You saved me," she said. Micah shook his head. She did. I just happened to be standing close enough to catch the pieces when everything started making sense. Kagan smiled, then real, open, tired in the way only peace can make you tired. "You could have walked away," she said. "I did, every day, until you walked in." They didn't kiss. Not yet. But something in the space between them closed. And stayed closed. And so did. That night, Ari woke from a dream she couldn't name and wandered into their room. She didn't speak, just climbed into the bed between them and curled against Kagan's chest. Kagan held her without question, as if her arms had been waiting in that shape since before she was born. Micah opened one eye, smiled faintly, then closed it again. The stars outside blinked slower. The world didn't end. It simply began again. There was no prophecy, no monument, no galactic announcement. The world didn't pause to recognize that a moment had passed, the kind that changes everything. It simply moved on. But in one small house tucked against the Oregon pines, something had shifted, quietly, permanently. A new rhythm had taken hold. Micah woke first these days, not from alarms, just the sound of small feet padding across wooden floors, searching for warmth. Ari always found it. Usually curled against Kagan, one hand buried in her hair, the other gripping a corner of her blanket like it held the universe in place. They didn't speak much in the mornings. They didn't need to. Kagan made tea. Micah cooked breakfast. Ari would sketch strange symbols onto napkins, whispering to herself in a blend of English and something no translator could pin down. Sometimes the drawings pulsed faintly before fading into ordinary ink. Sometimes they didn't. And sometimes Kagan would pause mid-pour, eyes unfocused, as if hearing a voice far above the clouds. But she never said what it told her. One afternoon, Micah asked, "What do you think she'll grow up to be?" Kagan didn't answer right away. She was braiding Ari's hair, fingers moving slowly, carefully, like she was weaving a story only the two of them would understand. Then, softly, something new. Micah tilted his head. "Is that good?" Kagan's eyes flicked up. They didn't glow anymore, not like before, but they still carried that same soft gravity. "It's inevitable." He smiled at that. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the future didn't need to be predicted, just allowed. Later that week, a letter arrived. No name, no sender, just a blank envelope with one folded sheet inside. It read, "She is still being watched, but for now, she is yours." Micah burned the letter without showing it to Kagan. Some things didn't need to be spoken. They just needed to be protected. Months passed. Winter came gently. Snow draped itself over the rooftop, like a breath held too long. The world outside hushed. Inside, Ari laughed for the first time. Not a giggle, not a mimic, a laugh. Sharp and bright and full of something no language had ever properly named. Kagan froze in place, her spoon still hovering over a bowl of warm soup. Micah looked up from across the room. Their eyes met. No words, just tears small and uninvited, but welcome. That night, Kagan sat on the edge of Ari's bed, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I used to think I'd never hear that sound," she whispered. Ari didn't reply, just reached up and placed a tiny hand over her mother's heart. Kagan held it there. Not to stop it, to feel it, to remember. And in that quiet, before dreams pulled them under, Kagan spoke not to her child but to the stars outside the window. "You built me to destroy. You shaped me for war. But she looked down. She made me a mother. And that was the future. Not something written in code or prophecy, but in lullabies, in small hands, in quiet rooms, and in the heartbeat of a woman who had once been forgotten, but now could never be replaced. She was built for war. But in a quiet house beneath the stars, she found peace, purpose, and a child who rewrote her destiny. From a forgotten journal to a cryopod buried beneath the trees, from being discarded by her creators to being chosen by someone who called her mama without needing to understand why, this was never just a story about aliens or humans. It was always a story about love, about choice, about becoming more than what we were made to be. And maybe, just maybe, the most powerful force in the galaxy isn't a weapon, but a mother with nothing left to lose. Thank you for joining us. If this story stayed with you even just a little, there's more waiting among the stars. Subscribe to Alien Chronicles for new stories every week of love, war, and the strange, impossible beauty that happens when species collide and choose each other anyway. Until next time, stay curious, stay human.